I would say if we are thinking, and specifically in the security domain, there are two main things that I would think unite the forecasts. One is just the sheer amount of violent conflict scenarios that we're looking at.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, we're taking a look at the year ahead. I'm joined by Sam Lichtenstein from RANE, and we take a look at their annual geopolitical and security forecast. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Sam, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
Very happy to be here. Always enjoy our, I guess, once a year chats, Chris.
Yes, our annual conversations. I always enjoy them. Now, there may be some listeners who haven't heard our previous chat, so I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and talk us through how RANE puts these sort of annual forecasts together. So today we look at geopolitics and security.
Yes, so we are a risk intelligence firm that is generally based in the United States, but we now have a number of analysts overseas. We cover the whole globe, and we have a number of different parts of the company that looks at things like business intelligence and a whole variety of other things. But the team that I help to lead really focuses on publishing daily content and carrying out client work for two main platforms. What folks are probably most familiar with is our outward-facing geopolitical platform. We're very well known for not just our annual forecasts, but our quarterly forecasts, and then if we really want to get interesting, our decade-long forecasts, and then as well as our more tactical security focused platform that really only goes to our corporate clients that are interested in that. So the forecasts are part and parcel of what we do. We like to think analytically. You have this very long, strategic, multi-year, decade-long forecast that sets like the very high-level trends. We then have annual forecasts that cover, obviously, what we're looking at over the course of the year. Those then get informed by our quarterly forecasts, and then within that, you have all the daily content in short and long-form pieces. And so we kind of have this Matryoshka doll, if you like, of different content that informs one another. And analytically, we try to always think, okay, what are these very small daily tactical developments, but how do they relate all the way up to those long-term, honestly, in some cases, decade-long trends that we're looking at?
Yeah, there's already been a volatile January. So what trends are usually the hardest to assess? Is it politics, security dynamics, or is it just human behavior?
Well, I would say of those three, it has to be human behavior. We take a dispassionate view of the globe. We're not interested in talking about how we want the world to be. There are plenty of other great advocacy groups and think tanks that put out great work. That's not our role. We try to take an extremely unbiased, dispassionate view of, okay, this is the reality. And so when you come with that mindset, there are a number of different analytic strategies and methodologies that we use that look at, fundamentally, okay, what are the drivers, the constraints, what are the things that are acting as forces on, whether it's political developments, economic ones, security ones. But human behavior is one where you can only do so much. Obviously, President Trump, famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, for being unpredictable. I would actually challenge that. I think there actually is a lot of predictability in his policy, but human behavior at the end of the day, can turn on a whim and just things that we don't have insight into. And so I would say you can account as much as you want for the strategic forces, but you can't always account for the whims of human behavior.
Yeah, fantastic. So looking at the big picture of this year's sort of forecast, is there anything in particular that sort of stands out to you most about sort of 2026? I mean, is there a particular theme or pattern that's sort of cutting through?
I would say if we are thinking, and specifically in the security domain, there are two main things that I would think unite the forecasts. One is just the sheer amount of violent conflict scenarios that we're looking
Mm,
at. I would say more than in recent memory, we have a number of ongoing conflicts at like a high tempo, whether it's, like civil wars, be it in, Sudan and Myanmar. We have a number of conflicts that are simmering at a lower level, whether it's still, multiple things throughout the Middle East. We obviously have potentially incipient U.S. military action again on the table in Iran, in the coming days. And then on top of that, a whole number of conflicts that are not yet even at the simmering level, but are like just below that and waiting to emerge. So I think the first thing I would say is just the sheer level of conflict. And then the second thing is and this goes, I guess, to some of the conflicts we mentioned. There are a lot of leftover conflicts that are unresolved from prior years, and the shoe has yet to drop on them, perhaps fully emerging. But there's a lot of unfinished business with different countries and groups at a sub-state level. And so those are the two things I think I would say about the 2026 forecasts.
yeah. Okay, cool. Well, let's do a regional walkthrough. So we'll start with Sub-Saharan Africa. What are the main kind of security dynamics you're watching out for there this year?
I think there are two main reasons to look at. I'll start in the Sahel because I think that's the more straightforward one, and then I'll move to East Africa. For many years now, it has been clear that the center of gravity in the global jihadist landscape has moved from the Levant to Sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically the Sahel. Basically, on all measures of data in terms of deaths, capabilities, etc. The Sahel is now the epicenter of the global jihad. You have a variety of Al Qaeda and Islamic State linked groups that are increasingly taking territory, holding territory, continuing on, building up their capabilities, and in some cases, advancing closer and closer to regional capitals. And that's a story that, we periodically get word on in the West when things get really bad. I'm sure you remember a few weeks or months ago by this point, there are a number of stories about, this fuel blockade that Al Qaeda linked militants had conducted and continue to do so in Mali. And so, you get these short bursts of media coverage when something really bad is ongoing, and then we kind of fade away. But this is one of those, undercovered stories that just continues to get worse, quite honestly.
Mm,
I would say in 2026, I would not hope for anything better. I think one of the things we're on the lookout for is that compared to prior years, this is the first year where there is now, I would say, a plausible option for one of these groups to, if not fully take over a regional capital, to certainly basically encircle it, make life basically in paralyze daily life. That's not to say it will happen. There are reasons, there are strategic reasons some of these groups may not want to do that. But really, compared to prior years, this is the first year where it's really on the table as a threat. And that's important not only because of the awful things that are happening there, but because basically time and again we see in history that groups with a jihadist worldview, they don't stop at a local level, right? Their aspirations almost always expand into the wider region. We've already seen some of these groups being linked to plots elsewhere in Africa. But then, of course, at some point, they want to start targeting the West. And that's when we start to get really concerned. And so this is one of those things we don't just want to look at right now because of where it is, but also where it could go in the future.
yeah, that sort of threat's coming from more likely ISIS, because you've also got Al Shabaab in the region as well, who are doing all sorts of things.
Yeah, and that's actually I hesitate to say a good transition because you never want to call Al-Shabaab anything good, but a good transition to the second big thing I would highlight in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is ongoing risk of conflict in East Africa. This is really a region where you just have so many both interlocking, but also in some cases independent types of conflict going on. On the one hand, you have the civil war that's ongoing in Sudan. The Trump administration seems as though it's going to be trying to put some more pressure on both sides to come to some sort of a deal, but thus far they've been unsuccessful. And I don't mean this to be political, but as we've seen in other cases where the United States has intervened, say between like Cambodia and Thailand, just because the U.S. is able to achieve some sort of near-term ceasefire does not mean it is sustainable. And so, even if we get some sort of a deal, and the constraints to that are going to be significant, we should not assume that fighting is by any means going to end in Sudan. We also then, of course, have, as you just alluded to, continuing to expand across Somalia, Al-Shabaab. That threat is going to continue. Again, Mogadishu will be under perennial threat. But the real area that I would really emphasize is to go back to Ethiopia for a moment. We have this terrible war in the northern region of Tigray, between 2020 and 2022. And since then, a number of really notable dynamics have occurred that have just thrown into flux a whole lot of things within Ethiopia and elsewhere in the region. We've had a standoff between Ethiopia and Somalia over Ethiopia basically wanting port access through part of Somalia. That has been diffused, but has hardly gone away. Simultaneously, we have Ethiopia and Eritrea, which used to be quite on good terms. They have very much fallen out. Even just in recent days, you've had the Eritrean government basically accusing Ethiopia of being at war with them. So the risk of an interstate conflict on multiple fronts is increasing. And then within Ethiopia, you have multiple regions that continue to fight amongst each other and against the federal government. And against all this, by the way, you have national elections occurring in Ethiopia this year. So there's a lot going on in this region. And that's before I even get into the weeds of how countries like Egypt and the UAE and others are stirring up the pot. But suffice it to say, you have a number of internal conflicts and cross-border conflicts that are at risk of getting worse in 2026.
Yeah, well, let's segue into the Middle East and North Africa, because obviously there's some common ground there with regards to the extremism sort of rising. Like ISIS are also sort of got a sort of growing foothold in Syria and places like that. So I don't know if you could talk to us a bit about Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah, so on the one hand, we have, as you just identified, this concern over a resurgent ISIS. Now, I want to be very clear. Compared to what the group was capable of doing in the territory they held, in the early to mid 2010s, we are in a very different state. They are vastly denigrated since that time. However, that doesn't mean that they are not seeking to continually exploit opportunities to regrow. And so obviously when you have things like, this still, uncertain Syrian government transition, where you have lingering uncertainty over the role of U.S. counterterrorism forces in Syria and Iraq, any and all of these opportunities, the group will exploit. And so absolutely, the aspirations are there. Now it's a question of capability. And so we don't foresee, ISIS having some sort of massive breakout, any sort of, proclaiming a caliphate on any sort of scale in 2026. That's not going to be in the cards. But you will see the group absolutely try to, carry out more hit and run attacks, do, some sporadic suicide bombings, in particularly in Syria, just given the fractious nature of the security environment. And of course, most concerning, and this is really unfortunately a European problem primarily, exploiting migrant flows, exploiting the Syrian expatriate population in Europe. There are a lot of Syrians and others that, other foreign nationals who've been tied now to disrupted plots directed or facilitated or encouraged by individuals in Iraq and Syria. And so that threat is not going to go away by any means. And then you stack that terrorist threat on top of obviously regional conflict risks because before we even talk about U.S. and Israel and Iran, you have simmering conflicts between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. This is not being resolved anytime soon. Fundamentally, the two sides remain at loggerheads over the red lines. Same thing in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah. Again, you have simmering conflict. You have continued Israeli operations, and you don't have, any recognition on either side that the other's red lines are going to give in. At some point, these conflicts will reemerge. And then standing over this, of course, is, this renewed standoff over Iran. Now, this is obviously being triggered currently by protests. But, regardless of how this protest movement plays out, if we assume that the Islamic Republic survives, fundamentally, the disagreements between Tehran and the Israelis over the status of Iran's nuclear, ballistic missile program, and support for proxies in the region, those haven't been resolved despite the conflict that we saw last summer. And so there's going to be an ongoing risk throughout the year, regardless of what happens in the next few days and weeks, potentially with the protests, that you will see more Israeli strikes, potentially even U.S. strikes. And so you have a lot of ongoing concerns. And by the way, we just saw the Emiratis and the Saudis come to blows in a completely, wholly unanticipated conflict in Yemen that no one would have expected to just kind of reburst onto the scene in late 2025, early 2026. So there's a lot going on, to say the least, at the sub-state and super-state level.
Yeah, definitely. And the Iranian regime at the moment does seem at its weakest it's been in a long time because their proxy groups are being degraded quite heavily. So what do we think their chances of survival are? Is it sort of a 50-50 now? I mean, that might be a bit difficult to predict, but
Yeah, so, undeniably, the Iranians have been really hit hard by the Israeli and, to a lesser extent, U.S. campaigns against their militia and proxy groups. Over the past 2 years, you've lost significant numbers of Hezbollah fighters and capabilities. The Houthis in Yemen are still there, but they've also, lost a number of their capabilities. Most significantly, you had the fall of the Assad regime in Damascus, which was the most important regional power player for Iran to extend its influence. So they've been harmed. The challenge is, though, that means they have now doubled down on regime survival and pursuing a nuclear program, pursuing a ballistic missile program, precisely because they've lost what used to be the cornerstone of their regional security policy. And just because they've had a lot of their proxies denigrated, I should also, say in Iraq, where they're coming under increasing pressure to not be as allied with Tehran, that doesn't mean that they're not fully capable, and as we've seen tragically in the past 2 weeks or so, able of repressing their own people at home. And so I would actually say it's almost because they've suffered these losses abroad that they're actually even more concerned about keeping themselves in power now at home, because they don't have that regional ability to kind of exploit their power and their influence as they used to.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about sort of Turkey's peace process with the Kurds at the moment? There's some interesting sort of stuff there. Is there anything you'd like to discuss about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, one of these conflicts that has been ongoing for decades, and if they were able to end it, it would remove a lot of irritants from the region. The challenge is that it's not easy. And so, our basic outlook is that there will be, fits and starts progress here, but it's going to be very fragile. We don't expect some sort of major breakthrough at the moment to realize. And, I should also caution that even if we were to get some sort of complete demobilization of Kurdish militants, the complete acceptance of, whatever concessions Turkey were to offer, you would undoubtedly have splinter factions that would not accept that. So there would still be some, obviously smaller, but there would definitely still be pockets of insurgencies. There is a strong political component here because Turkish President Erdogan, he would like to figure out how to run for another term. The short politics of this is that it requires a constitutional change. You cannot do that without sufficient support in parliament, which he does not have, which is why he's trying to largely get a generally pro-Kurdish political party onto his side. And so part of what's driving the outreach to the Kurds is getting this political party to basically support this constitutional change. This is a very fragile process. There's a lot of politicking going on here. But fundamentally, as we've seen, I alluded to the red lines of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. The Kurds, have the same thoughts here, right? They don't trust, after years and years, the government in Ankara. And, whether they're right or wrong, the constraints on them not wanting to give up their weapons and fully demobilize are quite significant. And so there will still be, efforts towards this process. We don't foresee it like completely breaking down, but we also don't foresee it, this conflict having some sort of tidy resolution by the end of the year.
Yeah. And with the ongoing situation of Israel and Gaza, is there anything we should sort of be keeping an eye on for the year ahead?
Well, it's funny, as we're recording this right now, Chris, in theory, we're supposed to get more information today from the U.S. government about basically the next steps in post-war governance in Gaza, which is, a very nice, kind of aspiration. But if you actually look on the ground, all the reporting is that Hamas is dug in its heels. Israel is, continuing to carry out multiple operations. And, just if you look at leaks in the media, every few days you get a new report that basically, Israel is preparing, to launch new, campaigns, that Hamas is refusing to demobilize. So the short answer here is, at a political level, sure, we can, move along with these things and put out, papers and processes, but on the ground, the situation remains that Hamas, despite being very heavily degraded, is still there. It refuses to give up its weapons. Israel says you need to give up your weapons, and until they figure out how to overcome that dispute, which we don't see an easy way out of, there will be ongoing conflict.
Let's take a break and be right back with more. Well, let's look at Asia Pacific. So what are the key security trends you think stand out for this year there?
So, the question, I think if I had to rank, the question we get most from our clients is some version of if and when China will invade Taiwan. I want to be very clear, if we do not foresee that is in the cards for 2026. But you will see a couple of notable things. And if you're thinking on a multi-year timeline, they're still very informative. The first thing is you will continue to see, daily incursions by different Chinese maritime and aerial assets across into Taiwan's aerial defense zone, territorial waters, etc. You will see these periodic, much more massive, complex, coordinated Chinese military drills. The past 2 years, we've seen 2 rounds of these in each year. We see no reason that that's likely to change this year, because fundamentally you have a government in Taipei that is pro. I don't want to say they're not pro-independence necessarily, but they are pro-sovereignty. However, from Beijing's perspective, that basically the same side, 2 sides of the same coin. So you will see more of these pressures. What we're more concerned about, and maybe not even necessarily in 2026 compared to the coming years of the decade, is the short of war scenarios. You don't necessarily need to see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, but what happens if China shells one of Taiwan's outlying islands? What if China puts some sort of blockade around Taiwan? These short of war scenarios, could really basically, force the United States and other regional governments that would presumably play a role, Japan, Australia, et cetera, to basically consider, okay, are we willing to intervene for this, not necessarily a Chinese invasion? Again, we don't necessarily think those short of war scenarios are the likely outcome in 2026. We will continue to see Chinese military coercion, more sabotage, these drills I spoke about, et cetera. But actually, what we see as more likely this Chinese invasion in the coming years, at least, is these short of war scenarios. And so we're looking for indications that those are becoming more likely in 2026. That's probably the big story. The one that nobody's paying attention to, but we suspect they will at some point in 2026, is at some point the Trump administration is going to remember that North Korea exists, and they are going to want to do something about this again.
Yeah.
I think the U.S. national security strategy, if I'm remembering correctly, didn't actually even mention North Korea, which is quite striking. So at some point they're going to remember that there's this massive nuclear armed state that's menacing, 30,000 U.S. troops shortly just across the border in Seoul region. And so what we're looking in 2026 is we actually now have a government in Seoul that, compared to the prior one, is more dovish, at least comparatively, towards the north. They are trying to lower the temperature. And so, you can never rule out some sort of cross-border incident. Just the other day, we had North Korea accuse South Korea of launching, some drones over the border. This seems to have been either a hobbyist, or maybe even the incident was not really as described. But the South Korean government has tried to lower the temperature. So that reduces the likelihood for, major cross-border shelling or, a drone incursion with that's armed or anything like that. Always on the table, though. What we're concerned about is if and when the Trump administration decides to reengage, and, we've seen comments that they are anticipating getting to round of this eventually. Just as we saw when the Trump administration did this the first time, there was all of this great love fest. I'm sure you remember Kim and Trump exchange, what Trump called, like love letters, which all sounds well and good until the talks completely failed. North Korea became even more belligerent. They test fired a huge number of military capabilities, and things were actually left in a worse place than when they started. So, if we fall into a similar dynamic here, what we've seen thus far is a de-escalation, comparatively speaking, on the peninsula could easily turn the other way. And so that's one of those underappreciated risks I think we need to be looking out for in 2026 in the region.
One other question as well is about what's the situation with sort of South Korea at the moment? Because there seems to be, because they ousted their previous president, there's inquiries going on, there's calls for death penalty. It seems a bit volatile in South Korea currently.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when this happened, I saw something on my Twitter feed, that seemed to suggest that there was some sort of like coup attempt or something
Mm,
underway. And I immediately like messaged, our Asia Pacific analysts, what is happening in South Korea now? I mean, you know, in recent times, we of course think of South Korea as a very stable, very, American Western ally. Things run on time. They have everything together. The history of South Korea is actually quite different. It was only fairly recently that they democratized. They lived under a brutal dictatorship for many years. There was a whole lot of political instability. So we've seen this, this history reemerge from the past year and a half.
yeah.
We don't foresee anything approaching that. The episode in which basically the former president launched what turned out to be a horribly miscalculated, basically like self coup against the parliament, completely failed. He's now facing charges of treason that just in the last day or so, it seems as though the South Korean prosecutors may be pursuing the death penalty. We have a new government in power that seems to have general popular backing. So we don't foresee any, re-escalation along that front. The thing that we are looking at, though, is that, South Korea has become quite polarized. And so you now have a government that has taken over that, according to critics, and, I would say if we're looking at it, just independently, I would generally agree, they're basically pursuing their, aggressive pursuit of power on multiple fronts in ways that, if not strictly, illegal, are certainly pushing the boundaries. And so you're getting a lot of complaints among political opposition in the country that basically the new presidential administration is going too far. And so you will see some risk of, say, labor union strikes, pushback on certain fronts. And there will be more accusations that the new government is, doing its own bad things. But in terms of anything like we saw, I guess what about just under a year and a half ago, we don't foresee that being in the cards.
No, fair enough. And what about the sort of Thailand-Cambodian conflict that's going on? Because again, that feels a little underreported over, at least in UK, it does.
Yeah, this is one of those things that, I don't think basically 99.9% of people across the world knew even existed as a point of contention. And over the past year, certainly that has changed. I actually have some family members going to Thailand in the next month, and they're continually asking me, okay, like, is it safe? I'm now really paying attention to this border dispute that no one even knew existed.
Yeah.
This is one of those conflicts, I alluded to earlier. You've had U.S. intervention, you've had Southeast Asian intervention, and we've had numerous times in 2025 where the two sides agreed to a ceasefire only for it to break down again. And so we don't foresee any real significant change in that. Fundamentally, the two sides are at loggerheads over historical disputes, over territorial boundaries, among other things. And as of now, neither side seems willing or able to either use force to decisively change that or negotiate diplomatically to facilitate some sort of end. So, yeah, you're not going to have, we don't foresee as, some sort of mass, extremely high intensity all over the country conflict in 2026, but there will be a high risk of repeated flare-ups periodically along the border. We saw an incident a few weeks ago where a Thai jet actually bombed deeper into Cambodia. So that is one of those things that we're tracking, because if we see a geographic expansion of the conflict, that's when we start to get more worried. For now, it's primarily along the borders, it's primarily contained, and it will happen repeatedly, over time we foresee. But we don't foresee the most likely scenario being one in which, the two countries engage in some sort of, massive high-intensity conflict akin to what you see between, say, like Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, they would both have a lot to lose.
Absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is good by any means. It's more one of those of like, managed, managed badness, so to speak.
Yes, yes, yeah, it's probably a good expression actually for a lot of things right now, managed badness.
It describes a lot of the world most of the time.
It does. It does indeed. Now let's look at Europe. So, what are the kind of key things there? Obviously, Ukraine's still an ongoing issue, but yeah, what sort of stands out for you with Europe at this time?
Yeah, so I mean, let's take, I guess, Ukraine and then the ramifications of Ukraine in Europe. So, I mean, compared to any other year since the Russian invasion in February of 2022, I would say that the likelihood of some sort of deal to de-escalate the conflict is at the highest it's
Mm,
ever been.
mm,
That doesn't mean it is going to happen, though, by any means. There are severe constraints. I mean, we just saw at the end of 2025, weeks of the Trump administration, proclaiming we're very close, and they would go to one side. And we see this oscillating campaign from the Trump administration of, pressure on one side and then moving to the other. But fundamentally, we have disputes over territory and security guarantees. There's a lot of other things, the status of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Russian assets in Europe that have been frozen, all these other issues that are in the mix. But fundamentally, it comes down to who controls what territory and what are the security guarantees. Those are the two by far biggest sticking points. And the challenge, as we've seen repeatedly and is, sadly quite predictable, is anything that is palatable to Ukraine is not for Russia and vice
yeah,
versa.
yeah,
So we do not foresee any easy way that those things are going to be cleared anytime, certainly the beginning of the year. The reason I say that, I think that you have the door open for some sort of a deal later in the year is that you have increasing pressures on both sides, both domestically and externally, whether it's, things weighing on their economy, whether you have, pressure from the Trump administration. But fundamentally, Russia, has maintained maximalist positions. It has shown itself willing and able, despite damage to its broader economy and otherwise, to always prioritize the war over other national goals. Um, and so, as it continues to take very slowly but steadily more territory in Ukraine, that will incentivize Kyiv to make what will inevitably be unpalatable and unsavory concessions on territory. Russia, we can foresee a scenario in which there is, some sort of acceptance of what will end up being weak Western security guarantees. And so we see, the trajectory of this conflict very clearly what we think what will happen. It comes down to timing, whether it's later in 2026, whether it's 2027. But we foresee a deal that from, Ukraine's point of view will not be great. It will involve making painful concessions to Russia in return for security guarantees that will not be as much as it would like. But in the interest of ending the conflict, that's what we eventually see as the playing out. I think you could see something like this happen especially towards the end of 2026. It may take longer. But again, I think the trajectory of how this will end up is clear. It comes down to the timing. What that means for Europe, most importantly, is Russia's ongoing destabilization campaign. And I mean,
mm,
this has been, I hesitate to say a favorite topic of mine because it's really deadly serious, but it's certainly one that I really, for lack of a better word, I guess, enjoyed being able to really look into because it is just a fascinating example of a state being able to, unfortunately, in some ways successfully use asymmetric pressure, in other ways less successfully. But at a baseline, this campaign is not going to stop. I mean, Russia has every motive and thus far still capability to do this, basically largely using proxies. The thing that I am concerned about for Europe in 2026 is there are a number of ways in which this could get worse. So, for instance, we've seen Russia become increasingly risk tolerant, both in its physical and its cyber campaigns. As it does that, especially when you're primarily relying on proxies, one time all you need is for, some guy who's building, an improvised explosive device to put it in the wrong place or use too much explosive material. And all of a sudden, instead of just, destroying, one very targeted area, of a building, you now have a much larger explosion that kills civilians. So what happens, if there's one of these incidents that leads to civilian deaths? Similarly, we've now seen a number of Russian cyber intrusions that have gone beyond just probing networks, pre-planting malware to actually seeking to take control of critical infrastructure. what happens if one of these attacks goes farther than they anticipate? And they, the thing about digital controls is no one's really sure how they all connect to one another. So, you may think, okay, on this dam that I now have access to, I may just be futzing with some very small thing, but that small thing could be linked to something much, much larger. So what happens if, water, overfills a dam and you have severe flooding? These are not out of the question by any means based on what we've seen thus far. So, one thing to consider is this risk tolerance. The other is on the European side, to the Europeans' credit, they have really stepped up their game in terms of trying to deter people from doing these things in the first place, prosecute them after the fact. And so, they've had some successes. But the more Europe becomes proactive in doing these things, the higher the risk of some sort of direct confrontation. One good example of this, or good, quote unquote, is say, like the Baltic Sea. After all these accusations of Russian like cable cutting and use of shadow fleet vessels, et cetera, Europe has now stood up a whole number of maritime defense capabilities there. But what happens if, you have a European, naval vessel that is challenging a Russian one? And we know, by the way, that the Russians are putting, some of their paramilitaries or intelligence officers onto these ships. What happens if there's some sort of, ramming at sea or some sort of clash? Or what happens if Russia again sends a whole lot of drones, let alone, an actually human piloted aircraft into NATO airspace? And, NATO decides, okay, I can't detect what's going on here. I'm going to fire. These are escalatory, but they are very real, plausible scenarios that could happen. And so, these risks are all going to be on the table, especially if, as seems to be the case, Europe is the one that's going to be taking the lead in defense of Ukraine more than the Americans. And that will put a target on Europe's back for a long time.
Yes, indeed. And, as you're saying, some of the kind of underhand methods Russia's using, Russia's also trying to destabilize the political environment in Europe. And there's a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric connected to sort of far-right politicians that's sort of growing currently in Europe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in terms of trying to stoke unrest, influence the information environment through misinformation, disinformation, et cetera. I mean, all those campaigns are going to remain prolific. By the way, regardless of what happens in Ukraine, I'm sure, you saw about 2 weeks ago, there was this incident in Germany where a far left group, sabotaged part of the electrical grid going into Berlin. It was like the longest outage in Berlin since the Second Cold War. And, it was pretty clearly this far left group, the Volcano group, Vulcan group that has done these things before. But we actually had to have an internal debate on our team because Russia has previously masqueraded as some of these extremist groups and, carried out incidents. And so we actually debate, could this actually be a Russian operation? And I say that because it just goes to show you, A, how well they've actually done some of these things, and then B, how they've actually conditioned us. We actually now need to think, could there be a Russian hand behind there, even if there isn't? So not only have they been effective, but they've also been effective in making us think that they're the boogeyman, that they're everywhere, even when they're not.
Yeah. The Heathrow fire last year.
Yeah,
at
absolutely.
The power station. Yeah, there's still a lot of people who believe the Russians are behind it, but the investigation conclusively concludes it was actually just a fire. But people are still not convinced by that. But
yeah, and that's a success. In the information environment, they've now conditioned a group of people to think that way. Even if it wasn't the case.
Yeah, indeed, and and it's one's got to be careful with the reflexive. All the Russians did it. Yeah, you got to be so careful now. But then when they do it, there's the other problem as well, is then having to confront that, so and persuade the public, because there's still, I think, a lot of people who haven't quite caught up with the reality of what Russia's up to and still think that this is people who are wanting to kind of rehash Cold War talking points or grievances, even though Russia are very aggressive in the space in Europe at the moment. So, yeah.
No, I mean, the threat is very real, and it could get worse, which is the short answer in a very tragic way.
Yeah, indeed. One other thing that stands out is the Azerbaijan-Armenia kind of conflict, and I think the report's saying it looks like it's going to decline and relations will normalize between them. Is there anything you'd like to speak to about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is another one of those areas where the Trump administration has intervened to its credit with some success in bringing these two countries together. I mean, the short answer is, there's been this long-standing dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Some listeners may remember this, idea of there was this territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, which, was this enclave that now Azerbaijan decisively took, I guess, about a year and a half ago now. They still have other disputes, including over their shared border, over what some status is, some language in Armenia's constitution. So, I'm definitely, dumbing things down, so to speak here. There's a lot more complexity to it, but the
Yeah.
short answer is we're in a scenario where the two sides are trying to de-escalate, in part under U.S. pressure, but the fundamental differences remain. So, for instance, Azerbaijan and Armenia have now committed to some sort of peace declaration, but we haven't actually implemented it. And part of this is that the short answer, and that I hope I don't bore your listeners with, is Azerbaijan basically wants Armenia to change its constitution to remove text that it sees as violating its national sovereignty and claims to Azeri territory. Azerbaijan, by the way, has military overmatch over Armenia. If it wanted to invade, in a whole-scale way, it could do so quite effectively. That's not what we're talking about here. The problem is Armenia and its current leader, Nikol Pashinyan, understandably, especially, by the way, in an election year, is not willing to give up concessions to longtime foe Azerbaijan. And so he keeps punting and this idea down the line and putting the can down the road to basically say, okay, yeah, we'll get to this. At some point, Azerbaijan is going to get impatient, sufficiently so that, it is going to want to coerce him. So we're not talking about, some sort of massive invasion, but, an uptick in cross-border shelling, maybe some sort of small incursions. All of these things are on the table, in 2026, because even as they at a high level are trying to lower the temperature, you still have these disputes that remain unresolved. And that will incentivize Azerbaijan as the one with the stronger military capabilities here to figure out how to coerce the Armenian government.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Is there anything else you'd like to add for Europe?
I will say, Chris, I cannot believe that I need to bring this up. I think we need to talk about Greenland for just a moment.
Okay. Yeah, why not?
There was a bipartisan group of U.S. Congress people who just earlier this week introduced a resolution, basically calling on the president to not invade another NATO country. And, I kind of saw that news and I'm like, is this really something we have to say in 2026? But apparently it is. I want to be clear, we don't foresee some sort of massive U.S. invasion by force to take, control, whatever that would mean, as likely. The thing is, you have to keep it as a scenario based on the rhetoric we're seeing. I do think if you look at how Trump negotiates, we often start with these maximalist positions. He frequently, refuses to rule out military force, just to, say it's on the table, keep everyone guessing. And so, there are, the more likely thing is that there's some sort of, U.S. coercion that results in concessions from Denmark and other European countries that are backing it on some areas. You do already, by the way, have an existing U.S. military facility where we can, by treaty, pretty easily expand our capabilities. I think you'll see some of these things. But yeah, you do have to think about what would happen. And the short answer, I mean, if the U.S. were to actually forcibly try to take quote unquote Greenland, I mean, that's the end of NATO, right? I mean, you cannot have the United States invading the territory. So, it's one of those incidents that we would call low likelihood but high impact. And it's important to consider because in 2026, these things are on the table.
Yeah, sadly, we can't rule anything out at this time with anything. I mean, yeah, as you're saying, it'd be the end of NATO, and there's already in the last week in Europe, there's been an awful lot of sort of press with various people who've been taking very anti-American positions and even talking about potentially taking American bases in other European countries by force, which in my mind, strategically, would be great for Russia because then we're all fighting ourselves.
Yeah, I was about to say, who loves this is Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, by the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the more, NATO is distracted by this and not the Russia threat, I mean, the easier this is for the sabotage campaign, for the actual kinetic operations in Ukraine, et cetera.
Indeed. So yeah, let's hope it stays in the unlikely category. But yeah, it's one to keep an eye out on at this time. So that's cool. So So with Eurasia, is there anything else that sort of stands out for you?
No, I mean, obviously, we spoke about the war in Ukraine, and we spoke about Armenia, Azerbaijan. Those are the two key flashpoints. I would just say if, in terms of Ukraine, we spoke from a diplomatic level, on the ground, our expectation is that the Russians are unlikely to make some sort of massive strategic breakthrough. I mean, the Ukrainians, for all the challenges that they're suffering, they have incredibly well built defenses. But that doesn't mean that the Russians won't continue to make the slow but still steady progress that they are on the ground. And so it may be, a matter of very small increments of gains, but the Russians, they have shown themselves with the willingness and capability to do that, and
Mm.
basically just, allow a huge number of their citizens to die tragically, for these tiny little gains, and they will continue to do that. That will only add more pressure on the government in Kyiv, to make some of the aforementioned concessions that I mentioned. And by the way, standing over all this, we have basically this détente that existed among Ukrainian politicians throughout most of the war that is rapidly coming undone, and we're basically
Mm.
seeing political instability return to Ukraine because you have Zelensky's government, who, of course, has been facing a number of ramifications of this, horrific corruption scandal that broke in November. And you now see, more and more politicians that appear to be maneuvering behind the scenes, thinking about, okay, what happens in a post-Zelensky government? Because the moment that there is some sort of de-escalation of the war, people are going to start talking about elections. And I would say that, one thing Russia is going to say in any final deal is, Zelensky needs to leave. They already say that his government's not legitimate. That's one of their pretexts for not negotiating with him. But there will be political change in Ukraine, and no one is certain what that will look like. And the only thing I can tell you is that for certain is that there will be people that don't like whatever that new thing is, and concessions that are made to Russia will aggrieve a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think if I remember correctly from the report, there's even concerns that with whatever the situation ends up being with the war coming to a conclusion, let's hope it does come to a conclusion, that there will be concessions that then people who fought in the war might not be happy with and might use violence to express that grievance.
Yeah, I mean, there people periodically talk about, is there some sort of coup risk in Ukraine? We see that as very unlikely, extremely unlikely. I do think, though, that realistically, if you assume, whether it's in 2026, 2027, et cetera, that there is some sort of deal to end the war, and you assume, as we think, at a personal level, I think tragically, but I think realistically is what will happen, is that the deal will favor Russia, in terms of, fairly weak security guarantees for Ukraine and fairly strong territorial gains for Russia. There are going to be Ukrainian politicians and, most importantly, servicemen and women who have weapons who are going to be unhappy about that. Now, we're not talking about some sort of mass march on Kyiv. No, but there will be pockets of discontent.
Mm.
And, you will have a scenario, especially because, by the way, any deal to end the war is not really going to end the war. It is going to pause things. Russia will still coerce Ukraine. There will still be sabotage. There will still be an ongoing risk of it reflaring. And in that environment, quote unquote, men with guns are a dangerous thing. And so, whether it's, not following orders in some pockets, whether it's, very violent, potentially protests, we're not talking about some sort of, collapse of the Ukrainian government. But we are talking about, there will be this risk that there will be some pockets of resistance to whatever deal is made.
Let's take a break and be right back with more. So looking at South Asia, what are the key security dynamics worth watching for with South Asia?
So the most obvious one is we're on alert for another flare-up between India and Pakistan. I mean, two nuclear powers who, again, last year came to blows over a number of days. Thankfully, of course, didn't escalate anywhere close to nuclear use, as they never have. But it's always been kind of that lingering concern in the background, right? And so, again, this is a conflict, to go back to what I said at the beginning, so many unresolved things, sure, there's a détente since, they're fighting last year, but the fundamental parts of the dispute, remain on the table. They're not being resolved anytime soon. And we've seen in the last round of fighting in 2025, a geographic expansion. And that's why it's concerning, because whereas they used to fight in the disputed areas of Kashmir, they expanded into each other's territory beyond that. And so that
Mm.
means that the next time there's a burst of fighting, we should assume that's the baseline. It's no longer just in Kashmir, it's there. We also saw the use of different weapons that we hadn't seen before and capabilities. So again, now that we've put those on the table as the norm, we should expect them to happen the next time fighting breaks out. And as we continue to see each side accuse the other of various misdeeds, regardless of whether they're accurate, that raises the temperature. So that's the first thing. Pakistan, unfortunately, though, then has a whole lot of other problems, because in addition to worrying about India, it has really escalated this dispute with Afghanistan over the past year. And we, later in 2025, saw repeated Pakistani attacks into Pakistan. This is, from a U.S. perspective, quite ironic, because, of course,
Mm.
for a long time, we saw when we were in Afghanistan, worried that the Taliban were receiving support from the Pakistanis. Now the Pakistanis are very upset with the Taliban, because the Taliban are either unwilling and or unable to basically bring this group, the TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is this very vehemently anti-Pakistani group, from carrying out cross-border attacks. They, are accused of giving them safe haven, financing them, arming them, etc., or at a minimum looking the other way. And so, TTP has really expanded its capabilities. They have every reason to continue to attack Pakistan. Pakistan seems to be escalating its retaliation into Afghanistan. And so Pakistan now needs to, think about, okay, how far are we willing to go? I don't think we're talking about, a massive, full-scale invasion of Afghanistan, but absolutely some sort, more frequent airstrikes, more border disputes, potentially even, small incursions into neighboring,
Mm.
border areas. All these things are on the table. And meanwhile, Pakistan itself, in addition to TTP, I believe 2025 was the most violent year in terms of armed conflict, within Afghanistan, because you have all of these anti-government groups, not just the TTP. You have, separatists in Balochistan. You have a whole lot of other extremist groups of various spades. And so they have all of these problems abroad and at home that they're going to have to continue to confront, because right now they don't seem to have any easy way to resolve any of these disputes.
No, it's definitely one to keep an eye on then. So let's move us to the Americas then. So obviously, that's been a key focal point in the last sort of few weeks with the action in Venezuela. And there's a lot of questions now, and there are concerns that the US government might well engage in other similar activities with potentially Cuba and even Mexico.
Yeah, so I think it's actually useful to almost put Venezuela to the side for a moment,
Fair
because
enough.
the Trump administration came into office very, very clearly signaling, which we've seen in policy documents and rhetoric constantly, that the Western Hemisphere is going to be its focus, and they feel as though U.S. has been expending too much blood and treasure in faraway places. We should focus on our near abroad, our
Mm-mm.
sphere of influence, and the threats here. And, they've of course linked that to drug trafficking, migrant trafficking, violent crime, etc. All of these things that they accuse basically the governments to the south of them of bringing into the United States. We can also include Canada there, but that's a
Mm.
separate issue. We won't go there.
Yes. Poor Canada.
Um, so, regardless of Venezuela, the Trump administration has been very clear that they're going to amp up pressure. And we've seen, reports long before what occurred on January 3rd in Caracas about Trump administration preparing to carry out strikes against drug trafficking groups in particularly Mexico and Colombia. And so, what happened in Venezuela is not necessarily something that changes the calculus. It perhaps accelerates a little bit. But, the Trump administration has been very clear that they are going to conduct strikes, potentially even special forces raids against some of these groups across the region. Mexico and Colombia are at the top of the list, because we're thinking about fentanyl, primarily produced in Mexico from Chinese
Mm.
precursors, comes into the United States. Most other drugs, enter the United States through land border through Mexico, and Colombia is on the list, of course, because it's the world's top cocaine producer. Now, we have this added dynamic where President Trump and Colombian President Gustavo Petro have not been on great terms. They seem to be trying to de-escalate. Petro is going to visit the White House. But Petro's term is also up in a few months. He cannot constitutionally run again. He is most likely to be replaced by someone who is more on the right side of the political spectrum. So, we're not talking about the Trump administration carrying out, some sort of raid on leadership in Mexico City or Bogota, akin to what we saw in Caracas. But we are talking about absolutely drone strikes, airstrikes, potentially even ground operations against drug trafficking groups in those countries. And those could become quite expansive over time. I mean, we think about what the Trump administration has been doing against drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific. They've now done, dozens and dozens of these. There's no reason that, they wouldn't necessarily hesitate to amp up their tempo on land as well.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Is there anything else about the Americas or the United States you'd like to add before we move into cyberspace?
Well, yeah, I would be, this is obviously a US centric thing, but, for our global listeners, we do have midterm elections this year. We
Yeah.
get a lot of questions from clients about political violence, given as polarized as our country is tragically, and given elections, that's always a bad recipe. So, I would just simply say, even just, in the past few days, we've had, all of this, continuing disagreements over immigration enforcement and what that means. And so, this is a tragically ripe scenario for something really bad to happen. Quite honestly, I'm surprised that we haven't actually seen worse fallout from the
Mm,
lethal shooting in Minnesota. This is one of those incidents where you have someone caught on camera being killed by a federal law enforcement officer in very controversial circumstances. We've seen a lot of unrest in the surrounding city. We've seen solidarity marches, but we haven't seen like major, civil disturbances since then, which is a good thing, of course. But that doesn't mean that this trend will last, and there will only be more of these incidents that open the door to those in the future, especially in an election year.
yeah, do you think there could be potential for more riots over the summer, potentially?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge that I see is that you have a Trump administration that is continuing to double down on this very aggressive immigration enforcement policy.
Mm,
And, particularly in urban environments, we've had hardline immigration enforcement policies under the prior administrations, but they were much, much more targeted. We're talking about a really unprecedented expansion of that to, the day-to-day, cities, which is a whole different ballgame than what we saw previously. And that is wrangling a lot of communities, including ones that, are more conservative and may otherwise support the Trump administration. And as we see the Trump administration try to deploy more and more, not just federal law enforcement, but National Guard troops, we're getting a lot of legal pushback. And I bring this up because the more legal pushback there is, the more it incentivizes the Trump administration to find creative ways around that. And the break glass option to get into the weeds is something called the Insurrection Act, which would basically empower President Trump. There would be inevitable litigation, but at least for some time, to basically not only deploy the National Guard, but also active duty troops. And not only that, but actually give them law enforcement powers, which means they would
wow.
be able to conduct arrests, searches, et cetera, things that technically only law enforcement can do right now. That would be an extremely controversial action, inevitable legal pushback, but also inevitable grassroots activist pushback. That's one of the triggers. I mentioned, the incident that we saw with the killing in Minneapolis a few days ago. We're going to have more of those, whether it's, as something as tragic as that is, an actual death, or, just someone who's just gravely injured. Phones are ubiquitous. This is going to be captured on video. There will be more controversial incidents. There will be more sparks. And you kind of have this fire, these embers that are, just waiting for a light to be put on them. And we're just going to see constant, opportunities for that.
Yeah, yeah, no, difficult times ahead for the US, I think. Yeah. Well, finally, then, let's move into cyberspace. Now, am I right? Was that a new addition to the report this year, or did I just miss it previously?
No, so we added it. So we've had it on our threat, because we have two forecasts. We have our geopolitical forecast and our tactical threat one. We had it on our threat platform's annual forecast for a few years now. What we changed is that we had removed it from our quarterly updates. So you may not have seen it in like the quarterly forecasts over 2025. It's only something that we include in the annual forecast. And we made the decision because we can make annual forecasts with sufficient, evidentiary backing for cyberspace. It's really hard to do that on a quarter by quarter
Yeah,
basis,
yeah,
especially because there's often a lag in cybersecurity reporting. Incidents don't come to light until some cases, like months even after they've happened. So, analytically, it was becoming, unfeasible to really do the service to our readers. And so we have it as a standalone in the annual, but not for our quarterly updates.
Got you, got you. So what do you think the key trends will be? Because last year was quite, especially in the UK, it was quite an eventful year for cyberspace.
Yes, I mean there are a lot of trends to highlight. The obvious one that everyone is going to talk about, and so I will only minimally talk about, is artificial intelligence, what that does for AI, or excuse me, what that does for cyber threats. I should acknowledge there are ways in which AI will also benefit cyber defenses, but we're concerned about the myriad ways in which it will improve cyber capabilities of threat actors across the board. That's the easiest thing to look at. There are so many ways in which AI makes it easier for threat actors to do things, speeds up the time for them to do things, makes things that they do more sophisticated. Not to mention that as AI gets integrated into more day-to-day life, the ability to exploit it widens the aperture. So, we're now, frequently, I'm sure you've seen this, you go to a website and there's, a little AI agent that is, ready, willing to help you, buy something online or do whatever. But all those things have flaws. We see AI-powered web browsers, becoming more of a thing. Again, that will just introduce new flaws. So it's not only that AI is giving cyber threat actors new capabilities or improving the ones they already have. It's also that as AI gets more integrated, you are going to have more, a wider risk aperture of how you can exploit AI. That's, something I think everybody's talking about. So I do want to highlight two other trends that I think are getting less appreciation. The first is about AI, but it's not what I think you're thinking about and what we just discussed. It's AI pushback. And so it's not actually a cyber threat necessarily, but as we start to see greater build out of AI infrastructure, I'm thinking about data centers in particular, and as we start to see more companies roll out AI tools, you are going to start getting more and more pushback from honestly just individual people, let alone more radical individuals on both the right and the left for different reasons that don't like these things. We've already started to see grumblings about AI, quote unquote, replacing jobs. A number of companies now, have come out with high profile statements to varying degrees, saying that we're making job cuts or at least pulling back on hiring because we're using AI more. That's going to create a lot of frustrated workers. And this is going to be, by the way, a long-term trend. This is not something unique to 2026. It's only going to get worse, but we're going to start to really see it more significantly in 2026 than we have before. So you're going to start to get pushback from workers. So there's going to be, more, insider threats. You're going to see more protests. You're going to see some people that tragically resort to violence, especially when you think, okay, from people across the ideological spectrum, there are a whole lot of people who are very suspicious about AI because of its, surveillance aspects. So you have some people, particularly on the far left, but also a number of people on the far right that don't like government control. You're going to start to see more pushback on environmental grounds because of the huge amount of water, electricity, and things that these data centers and other AI infrastructure need. You're going to get more pushback from social justice activists that worry that AI, is either perpetuating racial or ethnic or otherwise stereotypes. So there are a whole lot of ways in which AI is actually going to catalyze pushback, and some of which will tragically be violent. Explicitly then in cyberspace, the other thing that I would really highlight is the integration and the greater convergence between cyber threats and physical threats. Historically, we've treated these as quite distinct. You have your physical threat actors, your criminals that are you going to go steal your thing, or your terrorists that are, want to conduct an attack. And then you have your cyber threat actors that want to, wipe up all of your information, or, they're financially motivated. They're going to deploy ransomware, whatever their motivations mean, but they stay on their different planes. We are starting to see a greater convergence between the two, where one is abetting the other. And that's a big trend that we've seen in recent years, but it is going to accelerate in 2026 in more meaningful ways we see, where basically, for instance, you have, for instance, a cyber threat actor that's working with a physical threat actor. So, for instance, a hacker that facilitates entry into, a company's system that is then passed to an organized crime syndicate that can exploit that information. Or, you have scenarios in which you have the opposite, where it's actually the physical threat actor that's then facilitating a cyber intrusion. This is going to raise a whole lot of risks for corporate executives and other high-profile individuals that can now be, surveilled, for companies and organizations organizations that are thinking about how to just protect their people, their properties. And, if you are, a country like, go back to our prior conversation, like Russia, this is a godsend in some ways because you now can use your different groups that are either directed by you or, that you basically contract out to do a whole lot of mischievous stuff. And to that end, you're going to see, particularly governments like Russia, but increasingly others, double down on the strategy that we've seen of them using more proxy groups in cyberspace as fronts for their operations. And that just complicates attribution. It provides a veneer of plausible deniability, so it's harder to respond. And a lot of these groups, if you're not necessarily at a government level, are more risk tolerant because you worry a little less about blowback because you, in theory, have a little bit of this ability to, have plausible deniability. And so you have, more aggressive tempo of operations, more sophisticated operations. And what we're really concerned about is, we see all of this behavior in cyberspace where countries, criminal groups, et cetera, are pre-planting malware. We don't yet see them outside of, war zones like, say, Ukraine actually activating it to cause like a critical infrastructure disruption or destruction. But we saw that in the US raid in Venezuela, where it seems very obvious that US cyber capabilities were used in conjunction with other things to basically take out Venezuela's grid. This is going to be studied, and for some threat actors, they're going to aspire to replicate it to disrupt critical infrastructure elsewhere. So if you're thinking about how things to go sideways with Russia in Europe, or a future China-Taiwan contingency, or even the other conflicts we talked about, for instance, India and Pakistan, they have plenty of cyber capabilities on either side. Cyberspace is an attractive environment to do more aggressive things because you worry less about physical blowback immediately. But when you're targeting critical infrastructure, all bets are off on what that results in. And so, there are a whole lot of ways that this trend of, more aggressive cyber operations could really go south.
Yeah. One quick question about the AI thing. Are you anticipating any kind of political pushback with AI? Because obviously foresee a lot of economic instability ahead, because if you get mass joblessness, and also there's been reports or speculation, should we say, about potentially the AI bubble bursting, a bit like the dot-com bubble, that could also have a huge knock-on effect in the economy. Are governments or politicians, do you think, going to start looking at that aspect, maybe pushing back on AI?
Yeah, we're starting to see that certainly here in the United States. I mean, the Trump administration, for better or worse, has been very pro AI innovation. US tech companies, they should dominate the space, as they would say. But we've also seen, this now having political blowback where people in the United States do not love data centers being built in their communities. You have some otherwise very conservative Republicans that are national leaders, like, say, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who has been quite outspoken in saying, AI is a concern, because of job losses, because of other things, and so there are splits within all of these political, alignments over the wisdom. And so the Trump administration, absolutely, one of the issues they're going to, be confronting in the coming months ahead of midterm elections, aside from other, affordability issues, et cetera, one of the key things here is people are blaming the build out of AI for raising their power costs. Now, to be frank, yes, there is evidence that AI is contributing to that, but it's also electricity costs are going up for other factors. But the rationales and the specifics don't matter. It's now a political talking point, and so absolutely, that's one of those things. And you're going to see, European governments, just as others are going to struggle with how to balance these things. Where on the one hand, from a national security perspective, from an economic competitiveness perspective, they want to embrace AI and champion these things. Same reason that companies want to do them, right? They want to be as efficient as possible. They want to get returns for their shareholders or their private owners, et cetera. But inevitably, that's going to come with trade-offs, whether it's in job losses or lack of hiring or slower pay raises, et cetera. And so, we're not projecting some sort of massive, job loss catastrophe in 2026, but these pressures are going to build in the coming years. And so over time, absolutely, this is going to be a pressure point.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Well, Sam, thank you so much for walking us through the report. You've done a fantastic job. There's so many things we've covered today, which is brilliant. Is there anything in the forecast that you think deserves more attention that's of interest to you that we haven't talked about today?
Ooh, I mean, there's a lot in there, and I would just emphasize, we have these two forecasts, so there's plenty of topics that we didn't get a chance to talk about. I think if I would just leave with one thing that we haven't, but is kind of a meta topic that encapsulates a lot of these things is, I mentioned at the beginning, we have a decade-long forecast as well that goes, through 2035. And the key theme there is basically the breakdown in the unipolar order that had been championed by the United States. It basically is fully eroded by that period in the next 10 years. The growing return to multipolarity in 2026, the breakdown of this US-led world order is going to only come into starker relief. It's been ongoing. No one should mistake this as being some sort of inflection point. This has been happening now for years. It is going to deepen because the more you have the United States at odds with its European allies, the more you have the United States that's not only uninterested in upholding this order, but actually seeking to dismantle it, which is not something we've seen in other power transitions. Like, when the UK basically transitioned to the United States, it wasn't as though the UK was trying to tear down its world order. There was just kind of this natural erosion of its power. The United States took over. We're now in a position where the Trump administration appears to actively be desiring, we can debate the wisdom of this, to break down this order that the US has championed. And those trends are going to accelerate in 2026. And I bring that up because the more you have that means the more you are going to have the United States that's focused, say, on the Western Hemisphere, this ideas of spheres of influence, the more leeway that gives for other countries to try to dominate their own spaces, the more that means that you're going to have problems coordinating global solutions to global problems like climate change. The harder it's going to be to resolve regional disputes, like, for instance, take DRC and Rwanda and Sub-Saharan Africa, two countries we didn't get a chance to talk about. They've, over the course of 2025, repeatedly under U.S. pressure said, okay, we're going to stop fighting. Obviously, none of that has happened, right? Like, they're still fighting one another because as this order breaks down, it becomes harder to enforce constraints on armed groups, and the more incentive armed groups have to try to press their advantage. And so, you have this very strategic, high-level idea of the global order, but it has very tangible impacts on the ground. And that's something that I think is underappreciated, the connection between those two ideas.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Well, where can listeners go to learn more about your work and RANE?
So the easiest place is to go to ranenetwork.com. You can see it spelled out over here, RANE network.com. As I mentioned, we provide a whole lot of services, but the team I lead, our analyst team, we are always very interested in hearing from folks about, their perspectives. And we certainly hope that some people will find our services useful, to subscribe either just to our day-to-day content, or of course, if you're a company and you're trying to get an advantage in, forecasting risk intelligence, hopefully there's a way that we can provide a service.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Sam. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks again for having me, Chris.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.